Okay, so last week we were speaking about the last section dealt with the time of the judges. Basically the key verse in Judges says, and they did what was good in their own eyes. Why? Because there was no king. So there was no order, there was no one to really lead them. But they had forgotten what? The covenant, that God was king over them. In fact, in the New Testament we have Jesus inaugurating the kingdom of God. It's not such a new concept. In fact, it's an Old Testament concept. It's just that they don't use the words kingdom of God in the Old Testament. But the kingdom of God existed already. The disobedience came when they rejected God as king and wanted a physical man to reign as king, as opposed to the covenant which they had with him. And that's where we take up the story again. An odd thing, eh? Never talks about the kingdom of God in the Old Testament, yet there was a kingdom of God. I mean, there's four circumstances that leads to the demand of a king. They say there's the continuing discontent amongst the tribes, alright? There's the harassment by the Canaanites, and obviously because they hadn't driven out the nations, they were still sitting with the same problem. So the harassment of the Canaanites is actually due to their own disobedience. So now, due to their own disobedience, they are saying, but we want a king. When they didn't need one, they just had to obey God's commands. There's the plundering by other neighboring tribes as well. Same thing. They were supposed to drive them out, or they were supposed to become subject to them, as we said in last week's lessons. Then there's the afflictions by the Philistines, which they also never drive completely out. Now, although Samuel opposes the establishment of a monarchy, the Israelites' fortune is reversed under David. However, the problem here is there's four doctrines that get affected by wanting a new king. There's the kingdom of God, which is the first doctrine. There's the Messiah. There's salvation as deliverance, which is affected. And there's the kingdom of Satan, which would also be affected directly by the establishment of the monarchy. Just a little bit about salvation as deliverance. You see what happens with them over time when it comes to deliverance. They don't see it as a spiritual deliverance. To them it becomes a physical deliverance all the time. What happened in Egypt is not seen as a spiritual deliverance. It's remembered more after a time as a physical one. And that's a dangerous thing, because God is interested in our hearts. So when they look towards a Messiah, they look towards a Messiah who's going to deliver them physically with a sword. And he was never coming to do that. So it affects all of those doctrines. And in steps Samuel, obviously, in Samuel chapter 1, the son of Elkanah and his mom, Hannah. And then obviously there's the second wife, which gives Hannah grief. And out of this relationship is born a son called Samuel. And he's supposed to take over from Eli, who is the priest at that moment in the house of the Lord, with his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Morally took corrupt guys who's taking from the house of the Lord what they shouldn't be taking. In fact, what they're doing is when the meat is being brought as offerings, instead of just taking the portions which is supposed to be allocated to them as part which the law prescribes, when the meat is placed in the pot, they use tongs to take out what they want. And so they just leave whatever is over, which means there's a possibility that you're not eating enough, because the sacrifice was also a meal. It was a celebration. The sacrifice was not just an offering to God for sin or whatever. It was also a celebration after it. And then the family would eat together. Whoever made the sacrifice, they would eat together. Samuel grows up in the house of the Lord because he's offered up as his mom as a priest. She returns him to the Lord after he answers her prayer. Beautiful story. Both the timing of the event, which strikes one because we forget that God is in control of history. And at the right time, it says in the New Testament, he sent his son. Just so here at the right time he sends Samuel, because there's now going to be a transition in the history of Israel. And for that transition to happen, a particular man is now required at this stage. And the same pattern will follow when the king is elected, because each king has to brings a unique character to the story, but that unique character is required for the role for him as king at that particular time. And what happens here in this story is, as Samuel grows up, he starts learning how to hear from the Lord. Besides the prophet who prophesies to Eli and says to him, because it just says a man of God, they don't give his name really, who comes to Eli and says, your house will no longer serve. In fact, some of your descendants will come crying and ask for a position in the house of the Lord just so that they can eat. And along comes Samuel, who hears the word of the Lord, confirms the word of the prophet. And Eli says, if it was of the Lord, then so be it. There's nothing really that I can do about it. But he teaches the little boy how to learn, how to listen for the voice of God. The Ark of the Covenant is captured. That is the worst thing that can happen to them. Besides the fact that Hophni and Phinehas is killed in the war, the Ark is captured. And when Eli hears of this, they say he just fell off his chair and died. The daughter of one of the wives was supposed to give birth, she passes on too. So there's tragedy in this family all the way. What is interesting is the idea when the ark is captured that the Philistines were so daring to actually take up the sword and go up against Israel. If you go back into the history of Israel, before Israel even got to certain places, those people would hear of God and His mighty acts. It would precede them before they even got to that place. Here the Israelites is actually saying to each other, we will go to war. They're encouraging each other to go to war. And the text doesn't help me much. So I'm not going to try and impose some message into it, but it's interesting to note that they will not stand back. Even with all of the history of Israel, it seems to me, okay, that they had the idea that Israel was in turmoil and that they were not holding to the actual covenant. It's a possibility. But the text doesn't give me enough to do that with it. But it's just interesting to know. Hulle besluit nie, maar die kind van God kan my niks doen nie. Ek gaan nog teenstaan, ek gaan hom teenstaan. So they take up the ark, and the ark is taken first to Ashdod, Gath, eventually to Ekron, then possibly to Gaza and Ashkelon. Remember, those were the 5 main cities in the Philistine territory, and also possibly heads or kings when those cities were named after them. Die Viertel van die boek van Samuel would be raised, and he would have to fulfill 3 roles during this time before the actual king is put on his throne or chosen by God. He would have to be the priest, he would have to be the prophet, he would also have to be the judge. Now the judge would eventually become the king itself. That's a role that he would fulfill, but instead of being called judge, he would now be called king. So he would have to play 3 roles. What happened is, remember, Jerusalem, and then it was moved to Shiloh, and then eventually to Gilgal. Okay? But however, Samuel stayed at Ramah. So with the capture of the ark was not in a specific place anymore where they could go up to, or the nation would actually go up to. So we're still actually in the time of Judges, still actually in the time of transition now. So no one's really going up to the house of the Lord to make sacrifice. Instead, what Samuel does is he goes on a once-a-year round trip to certain cities so that he can do the sacrifice. So it's not in a particular place at this time. It says, when the Shiloh fell into the hands of Philistines, apparently Samuel returned to his home in Ramah, and he called upon the Israelites to repent of their sin of idolatry. And while they were gathered at Mizpah, the Philistines attacked. Samuel's prayers and the people's repentance prevailed with Yahweh, who gave a miraculous deliverance. That's in 1 Samuel 7:3-11. Now it says, the defeat of the Philistines was so complete that they did not rise against Israel again in the days of Samuel. But after the central shrine, Samuel made an annual circuit to judge Israel in different places. Why did he oppose the establishment of a monarchy? One, because he was committed to the covenant between God and Israel. It was because Israel was no longer committed to the covenant that they were calling for a king like other nations. I said to her earlier, in the Old Testament they don't use the word kingdom of God like we use kingdom of God in the New Testament, yet the kingdom of God existed in the Old Testament already, even though the name wasn't used. The Israelites is now saying, we don't want it, we want an actual human king. And that changes the whole ball game for them. So he opposes it because he was committed to the covenant relationship of the tribes with God. And secondly, as we'll see later in the history as we move along, it would be very costly to maintain a king and his army and his household. It was going to cost them. But that is not what they foresaw when they foresaw a king. They, instead of looking at the other nations and seeing what it cost the other nations, they just simply demanded a king. Now, our first king. What is it that would be required of such a king in such a time? Remember, the tribes is disjointed. There's a lack of cohesion between them. They're more looking after themselves, as I said in the previous lesson. They're more interested in their own tribe than other tribes, unless they were affected by a particular incident and it would affect them negatively. Then they would maybe join hands with another tribe and go to war. Other than that, they would only look inward and look after themselves. So, to bring them together, with the Canaanites still harassing them, with the Philistines still going, and neighboring tribes still coming in, you would need someone with military skill. Because remember now, they would have, once they pulled together, they would have to go to war with the Canaanites, with the neighboring tribes, and with the Philistines. So the first person you need is a military guy. He must have military ability. But more than that, he was to be chosen by God and endowed with His Spirit. He would be God's choice. And the prophet was the one who would deliver that word to say, this is God's choice. Yahweh's choice was revealed to Samuel the prophet, who in turn proclaimed Yahweh's will to the people. Samuel anointed soil with oil to signify his dedication to God. To be an effective leader, the king needed to be endowed with God's Spirit. The Spirit of God in Saul was manifested by his prophesying. Only problem with that is, at a later stage, that two would count against him. So who is the Saul then? Alright? He was a Benjamite from Gibeah, a village about 3 miles north of Jerusalem. Although it has not been regarded with respect because of his attempts on David's life towards the end of his reign, the difficulty of his task during a period of transition and his success in the light of many obstacles should be noted. He laid the foundation for the work of David, and you will notice in each of these kings' lives, they lay the foundation for the next phase in the history of Israel. Each one brings a little bit that they build on it. Mandela Bay built something, Rebecca did something which is coming to the fore now again. It must still get to the news, but it's going to be advertised in a couple of weeks. But so each one builds on the other's work. In the New Testament says one plants and one waters. After the destruction of Shiloh, Gilgal became the center of worship, right? Then Samuel said to the people, that's around the old shrine at Gilgal, come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. This recognition of Saul as king came after he had proven himself in battle against the Ammonites. So even prior to him being called and set up as king, he proved himself in battle. So he would need a particular skill for this particular time, and he would need to be he would need to have the ability to run an army, to manage an army, to lead from the front. However, here's the first problem. You see, remember, Samuel, priest, prophet, judge. However, once a king is established, then the roles changes now. Samuel would only be priest, would only be prophet. The role of judge would go to the king. It would change hands. However, Saul infringed on Samuel's duties by making a peace offering before battle with the Philistines, and Samuel rebuked Saul and announced that the kingdom would not be established with his descendants. He basically had to wait on Saul to arrive at Gilgal before they went to war. And because he thought Samuel wouldn't arrive, he decides to take up the role as priest and prophet. And he should never do that. God is very distinct when he administers to us certain roles or functions, especially with the gifts which is sometimes administrative or functional gifts. It's very important that we find and do specific things that God points us to. Don't go and do something which you are not appointed to. It will more than likely not succeed. See, the battle marked the beginning of a united effort against the Philistines, who were driven out of Israel, central Highland as far as in Ajalon. And it said that most of Saul's reign was spent in battle. Most of his reign was spent in battle. He basically just had to get the people to rally together, try to rally together as one. That was his function at this particular point, and then to drive out the nations again. You see, Samuel was willing to relinquish his leadership as judge, but not as prophet and priest. So, if I would say to you, political and military leader, under who would that fall? Saul or Samuel? Political. Prophet, priest, judge. Or king. Judge can also be transposed or used as a king can also be used. So if I said the religious leadership, then who would that be? Samuel. If I said political, Saul. Okay. If it's military, it would be Saul. That would be his functional roles. A second time he tries to usurp the role of Samuel. It is said that Saul refused to follow Samuel's instructions to destroy all of the people and livestock of the Amalekites. When confronted by Samuel, Saul claimed that he had spared the best of the sheep and oxen to make a sacrifice to Yahweh. And Samuel reminded Saul that to obey the Lord is better than sacrifice. That's 1 Samuel 15. Saul's disobedience of Yahweh's instruction given to his prophet led to Saul's rejection as king. And this event was followed by the secret anointing of David as king of Israel. And the Spirit of God departs from Saul. Tragic, actually. And when that happens, remember, once the Spirit departs from him, a new king has to be set up. And that is where David comes along. But not only when David comes along, it now creates havoc within what Saul was trying to do. Because this can rip apart the work that he was supposed to establish. You see. It says Saul's attempt to gain both political and religious leadership ended in failure and rejection. After the Spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, he began to experience frustration at every turn. He came emotionally distressed when Samuel rejected him. Then you have David's popularity, which threatens Saul's position, obviously. And when a leader is threatened, you've got problems. It's not good. And usually, if you look at the churches today, when the leadership is threatened in any way, you're more than likely to have havoc in that church, or even as much as a split. As soon as the leadership is challenged and not dealt with properly, you are going to have havoc. But in this case, the leadership is not challenged because of David's decision, because of him being called to be the new king. His own position is threatened by his disobedience, because the Spirit of God, who helps him to rule the country, is removed from him. How does Moses say? I will not go without you. I need your presence with me. You cannot rule without the Spirit, with the help of the Spirit. You cannot do that. You cannot lead the church without the help of the Spirit. Saul's conflict with David is the next part of this chapter. So he hears that David plays music, and actually somebody else tells him that David is quite a good artist. So he calls him in and David starts playing music to him, and that helps soothe his soul a bit. But that doesn't even help after a while. It just gets worse. The depression just gets worse. During this time, obviously, David becomes so popular with the people that Saul could not afford to put him to death directly. So what he's doing, he makes a few attempts on his life. First, he plans to kill David, and he sends him into battle with the Philistines. He promises his eldest daughter, but it backfires on him, because David is victorious, because the Lord is with him. He's God's new anointed. Secondly, he entices David again into the snare by death, offering him his second daughter, Michal. And the wedding dowry was to be evidence of the death of 100 Philistines. Again, David is victorious. And the daughter is given as his wife. He even tries to use his own son, Jonathan, to kill David. But because Jonathan and David are such close friends and his father is not aware of it, that backfires too. And he makes a last attempt at the New Moon Festival. He was going to kill him with his own spear, but David doesn't pitch. Saul's jealousy led to greater insanity and sordid deeds in his attempts to eliminate David. David's failure to appear at the New Moon Festival threw the king into an uncontrollable rage, and he cast the spear meant for David at his own son, Jonathan. He would even turn on his own family. That's how bad the depression got. And his obsession with killing David and taking him out. Saul became more concerned with destroying David than defeating the Philistines. And if you look at the rest of his life, that is what he spends trying to do, trying to kill David. Saul's dastardly acts alienated the priesthood and drove it into the arms of Israel. Saul caused a schism in Israel and weakened the people's defense against the Philistines. And as a result of his energy spent in the pursuit and destruction of David. Like I say, David's popularity is obviously increasing all this time, alright? Besides the fact that Saul comes after him 4 times, there's also 2 occasions where David has an opportunity to take out the Lord's anointed, and that's where the verse comes, do not touch the Lord's anointed. Right? In the wilderness of Engedi, near the Dead Sea, Saul entered the cave where David and his men were hiding in its innermost parts. And David could have slain Saul, but only cut off the skirt of his robe while he slept. Then there's a second opportunity to kill Saul in the wilderness of Ziph, when he and his servant Abishai slipped into the camp while Saul and his troops were asleep. Since Saul was Yahweh's anointed, David did not raise his hand against him, but took Saul's spear in a jar of water as proof that he could have killed the sleeping king. David concluded his only recourse was to escape to the land of the Philistines, and therefore he goes to the king of Ashish of Gath for a while. During the end of Saul's reign, alright, the Philistines obviously is gaining momentum again, because he's not doing his work as a king and not looking after the country. They go to war. Saul's 3 sons are killed. The king is seriously wounded, and he eventually takes his own life. The Philistines cut his head and hung it together with the bodies of his sons on the wall of Bethshan. The king and his sons were given decent burial by the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had great thirst, secretly stole their bodies. So, what is the significance of Saul's reign then? The only job that he had to do was establish national authority. That's what he literally had to do, nothing else. Besides that there was national authority, there was also freedom of movement through the country, whereas people were tribal once, they were now able to move easily through the country, because quite a bit of the Philistines, the neighboring tribes, and the Canaanites had now been driven back, obviously. Also very important, under Saul's reign, the people continued in tribal organization without the development of strong central administration by the king. Saul had no officials in his court other than his cousin Abner, who commanded troops. However, the foundations is being laid for a central government. Saul's reign also marked a transition in Israel's political structure from judge to king. Samuel, the last judge, required subservience of the king to prophetic and priestly commands. And Saul didn't always commit or submit to the demands of the religious leader, but occasionally inserted the supremacy of the political military monarch. However, Saul demonstrated his religious conscience by deep disturbance when opposed by the prophet. And during the later part of his jealous insanity, he admitted his guilt of trying to destroy David. Alright? Then lastly, Saul's reign also prepared the way for centralized government, as we said earlier, and separation of church and state. You see what happens now under a physical king. All life is sacred. If it's not sacred, then it's sacrilege. But all life is sacred. That's why in the New Testament, when it says God by his divine power has given you all things pertaining to life and godliness. From that perspective, God created all things. All things are sacred. Work, it doesn't matter what it is sacred. Because of sin, it has been turned into something else other than sacred. We use the word sacred and secular. Christians are not supposed to be using those terms. To us, all things are sacred. Whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. Obviously, he laid the foundation for greater days for the Israelite nation and provided a degree of protection from the Amalekites and the Philistines. In steps David now. David was the descendant of Boaz and the Moabitess Ruth. His father was Jesse of Bethlehem in Judah, and this little village was located about 6 miles southwest of Jerusalem. David was a shepherd, as we know, in his youth, and became to prominence when he slew that Goliath and became the personal dependent of Saul. Obviously, when he starts off, he has his own army that he puts together. There are about 600 men. So, and the city that they have for themselves is Ziklag. That's in the Negev, down at the bottom, the dry area, remember? So that's where they settle, and they move in and out. While in Ziklag, in preparation for his reign, David disposed of enemies in southern Judah. So he's already making for a name for himself, for the people. So he's obviously saving a few tribes from the raids that's coming in. And so he's gaining the trust of the people. While in Ziklag, David won the goodwill of Judean elders by returning possession taken by the Amalekites. Okay? So, like Saul, is chosen by God, and the prophet announces it. Same process. And we must remember that, because what happens later is not chosen by God, but by succession. Same thing in some churches today. Pastors, their sons are born into the house, son goes to college. Now there could be an advantage, if you look at it from a different perspective, in that the son knows the culture. So in a sense, the transition is perhaps easier, but it's more often not God's will that the son takes over. It is God's choice who runs the house. We may never decide as men who runs the house of God. It's His church. It's His kingdom. The same with the kings, the same principle will apply. So the process by which David becomes king of all Israel included the following. He was anointed king of Judah in Hebron. He showed respect for the former king Saul. Alright? And I think sometimes in my own life I get that wrong. We need to honor the man that is called. We need to honor the father of the house. It doesn't matter how we feel about him sometimes. Because sometimes we might get things very, very wrong. But it's not our call to dispose of him. It is our call to speak out against sin and unrighteousness. That is our call only. But to physically remove him from that office, that may not be our call, and we need to be careful in that regard. He commended those who risked their lives to bury Saul and Jonathan. Remember the bodies of the sons and Saul. The men of Jabesh Gilead secretly went in to go and retrieve the bodies and then gave them a proper burial. And obviously, David sees this, but he also sees this as an opportunity, because it's a diplomatic opportunity really. When he honors these men, not only does those men see in David something special, it's the whole tribe now that recognizes that he is a man with a different spirit. So there's a lot of things along the way that he does. It looks small, but actually it has a great effect on the rest of the people. And that is how he gains their trust. Okay, like Saul, divine election, same would apply here with David. Second thing, as in the case, even though they would rule differently and different skills would be required, remember it was still a time of war. So the person who took over would still have to complete what Saul had not completed. Alright? Because while going after David, he neglected his duties to look after the country again. And then, in this case, by popular assent, obviously the people need to take care. The people also need to approve that this is the man. The same in the house of the Lord, when they call somebody now and it's ordained, there's that approval from God, there's also that approval from those in the church. There's this confirmation between the one and the other, that this is the man of God. And like I said, the first major difference between Saul and David is David's strategy of gaining control of all Israel relied primarily on diplomacy rather than war, which would have further alienated the Israelites. He did engage in a border skirmish which resulted in Abner's killing a brother of Joab, David's kinsman and general. However, David takes into marriage the daughter of an Aramean king of Geshur, thus forming a political alliance with the state northeast of the Sea of Galilee. He also entered friendly relations with Ammon, and thus has Ishbosheth surrounded with allies. So he's making friends. In his case, instead of going to war now, he's making friends. David further enhances his position as king of all Israel by gaining the support of Abner, that belongs to the elder group in the tribe, demanding the return of Saul's daughter Michal to David, thus making him Saul's son-in-law. You see how he makes the ties now all the time. Because Saul obviously has a band of followers. By doing that, he gains their vote of confidence again. also displaying innocence in the murders of Abner and Ishbosheth. Even though the deed of two leaders was to David's benefit, he had them killed when they brought the head of Ishbosheth to him at Hebron. This action emphasized, says Viertel, respect for the appointed monarch and discouraged future loyalty. So while Saul was king, he made sure that he looked after him like a loyal servant within the house of Israel. That was God's anointed, and he would respect that. Any mutiny, he would treat as mutiny against the king. Saul's reign had prepared Israel for kingship. With the death of his son Ishbosheth, the Israelites had no one to turn to as king. Therefore they came to David at Hebron. Now what David does is, the first thing, he obviously has to have a capital. And where does he make his capital? Very clever, Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem, it's situated neutrally. It doesn't belong to either kingdom. More than that, it was well fortified. Even though Jerusalem in times of war is easily accessible, if, like I explained to you from the plains that they came through, if they came through the plain of Esdraelon, they could easily attack Jerusalem. And so he was aware of that, but then he goes and fortified it. Alright? That's the first thing he does, obviously. Jerusalem remained in the hands of the Jebusites, and thus belonged to neither of the two kingdoms. As a neutral and a well-fortified site, it was ideal for the common capital of city of the two kingdoms. The fortress could be entered only through the water shaft, which Joab succeeded in scaling. David's forces conquered the city, which came to be known as the City of David. The city was not incorporated into either kingdom, but remained the separate possession of David. Here's the other thing. Remember David at the time, during Saul's reign, who did he ally himself with? With the Philistines. In fact, he went to sometimes go and help them in battle. But that would now count against him, because he knew not only their land, he also knew their strategies of war. And that would make him superior. Not necessarily the armory, it was now a matter of skill. It was now a matter of nous, of the mind, and how to put into place proper strategy to counter any attacks coming from them. So he was ready for them. Same like Moses. Prior to taking them into the wilderness country, remember, that's where he learned how to shepherd the flock under his father-in-law. So God first sends him to the country to go and learn what the country looks like before he's going to take the people into the country. You're in the same place with David. David doesn't know that. For future reference, he sides with what we would call enemies of the state. So he learns all their tactics. Now it comes in his favor. They say no. Besides that detail, the one detail that is in, he drove them from Jerusalem and pursued them northwestward by way of Gibeon and down the valley of Ajalon as far as Gezer, about 20 miles. Apparently the Philistines did not attempt to invade the hill country again. No details are given concerning David's future battles with the Philistines, but apparently he defeated them and made them vassals. He made them slaves. Not necessarily slaves. Vassals would also be necessarily somebody who would be under subjection, but also would maybe just be taxed. So they wouldn't be forcibly removed of the country, retain their territory. They just had to bring tribute all the time. They would have to bring the taxes. Later Philistine soldiers even served David as mercenaries in 2 Samuel 8:18 and 15:18. So what does he do? During his reign in Jerusalem, to Israel's religious traditions, he moves the ark to Jerusalem, and he appoints Abiathar, the priest whose ancestors had served at Shiloh. They said the ark served as a symbol of unity for the 12 tribes after deliverance from Egypt, and they entering into the covenant at Mount Sinai. By transferring the ark to his city, David sought to make Jerusalem the religious center as well as the political capital of the empire, and to link the newly created state to Israel's previous political and religious structure under Moses. You see, the ark symbolized Yahweh's presence for the nation. The ark being housed in a tent enabled Yahweh to be with his people in their journeys. A permanent structure for the ark would symbolize the immobilization of Yahweh. In their travels, them moving about with the ark signified that God was with them all the time. Here, under David's reign, he's saying, I want to bring the ark into one place. In fact, it would be counterproductive. As opposed to, if you look at the fact that it was at Jerusalem, then at Shiloh, it was even at Shechem for a while, and then at Gilgal. So yes, they did come up, and all of the tribes came up, in a sense, to that one particular place. However, when that did not happen, something good came out of it, because now the priests traveled. He made a circuit, and so he made sure that he got to all of them, even to those who did not come up. And so the presence of the Lord goes with him, in a sense. Yes, the ark is in one place, but the presence does not leave the priest. He is the mediator at this moment. So he goes and takes the Spirit of the Lord with him, in a sense. So there's still mobility. Here the ark is going to be placed in one city again. And that changes the thing again. Now they have to come up. It symbolizes something else other than what it was meant for. Look what else he does. It says, David included the priests among the officials of his government. David's strategy to reverse Saul's policy of neglecting the ark and alienating the priesthood appears to have contributed greatly to the unifying of the tribes under his reign and the binding of their loyalties to Jerusalem. Remember, under the pharaohs, what one pharaoh, particular pharaoh, each pharaoh in his city-state was his main god. Then along comes a strong pharaoh that says, I will assign this god as the main god, and all other gods will then be subservient to him. So he literally crushes whatever revolt could take place, because they are now subject to this particular god. In the one case it was Ra, the sun god, which was also what we said the commencement of monotheism. So they use that as a strategy to bring the people together under their control. Again, a diplomatic strategy by him. The importance of the strategy can be seen in the day of Jesus, when the temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish national and religious life. And he does quite an expansion after that. Remember, we said under Solomon, it extended from, not only from Dan to Beersheba, it extended from Mount Hermon on top, right down to the Gulf, Aqaba. So he added another, I think at least another 100 kilometers. Because originally I think it was around about 320, when he added the territory, we looked at around about 450 to 480 kilometers in total, from north to south. He adds the Canaanite city-states, he adds the Philistines, and most of his conquests are recorded in 2 Samuel 8, 1 to 14, 10, 1 to 11, 1, and then from 12, 26 to 31, if you want to go and read up on all that. He conquers the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Arameans from Makkah, and Beth Rehob and Zobah. So all of these nations that were supposed to be driven out, if we can look at the list of nations that was in the country when they entered the land, he conquers. he finally conquers them. What they had to originally do when they entered the land seems to be done now only. And this is how the nations brought together and united. The country finally actually becomes theirs. It says David ruled from Egypt to Mesopotamia and brought great wealth and luxury to Jerusalem. He had become the most powerful leader in the world of his day, and at the time of David's conquest, the Egyptian and Mesopotamian dynasties were weak. The Syrians were busy pushing Arameans out of Aram Naharaim into the western desert of Syria, and David was left alone to achieve great success. His conquest brought great wealth and luxury to Jerusalem. Conquest through diplomacy rather than war. Talking also works. Good conversation helps. But not only that, he also married wives from his allies. So here you already see some sort of tradition created that his son is also going to take up what far worse, and it's going to cost him. David's glorious reign began to decline with the illicit affair with Bathsheba. The son that was born to Bathsheba died, but another was born after David had disposed of Uriah and had married her. This son, Solomon, was to succeed his father as king, even though he was not David's oldest son. So here is not even succession by what we would call the oldest son. In this case, it seemed that Bathsheba may have played a role in the choice of the son who was to rule. Because remember, he has an affair with Bathsheba. That is how Solomon is born. So actually, he should never be taking the throne. He promises the throne to his son. Here, for the first time, we see succession rather than God's choice. Even though we see him achieve quite a lot of things during his reign, he is not chosen by God. The funny thing is, because his heart at the start of his life is near to God, God even speaks to him and says to him, look, what is there that God says to him, I would like to give you something. What it is that you desire? He says, look, I've got everything already. What I need is wisdom to rule this nation. He asks for the best thing possible. As James says, if you ask for anything, what must you ask for? Wisdom. Because the wealthy is no longer wise. They know how to work with money. Not necessarily wise in all aspects of life, but they're wise enough to know how to deal with money, how to handle it. And that's what makes them rich. They ask for it. If you look at David's life, remember the monarchy is now being established, right? There's no palace here, nothing like that. Basically, the only way he's supporting himself is through the wars. Remember, as they traveled from Egypt to Canaan, that is also how they supported themselves. With those wars, the spoils of the wars, that is how they would look after themselves, but also fulfill God's commands by dishing out what we would call righteous punishment to these nations because their sins had come to the full. So God would use them in that way and provide for them at the same time. Remember, Saul said to them, be careful what you're doing because it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you financially. You're going to have to support the king, and you're going to support him, his army, his household, and so forth. Now, David hadn't built anything at that particular time. However, if we look at him, first of all, no reference to a taxation system to support the court and army. So basically, he's supported by the spoils of war, right? Apparently, judicial matters continue to be handled primarily by leaders of tribes. However, subjects could appeal to the king. So, same as in the case of David, or as case of Moses, when his father-in-law advised him, listen, you deal with the heavy matters, and then give to 1/1,000, 1/100, 1/50, 1/10. sort of the same structure still going, with the tribe leaders doing that for him, and then also allowing them, if they didn't deal with it properly, still then to make a second appeal. Like we have the Constitutional Court. If you're not happy with that report, you can go to the Constitutional Court. Same type of principle would apply. David's court was generally made up of a sizable harem. He had a number of clients and pensioners, and then he had a bodyguard. His original bodyguard remained loyal to him and provided a police force to ensure his control. Okay, but that was kind of limited. Under Joab, you will also see Joab also not showing loyalty after a period of time to him. So that's basically all that he had set up at that stage. I gave you the rule of his territory. We don't need to cover that. Like I said earlier, David's successor, he's got his first son is Amnon, his third son Absalom, and so the next in line to the throne was the fourth son Adonijah. David's second son Chileab is not mentioned, so there's 4 boys here who can take over. However, Adonijah became ambitious to occupy the throne before David's death. Although he was next in line, David had promised the throne to Bathsheba's son Solomon. Adonijah obviously tries to gain the support of Joab, David's general, and the priest Abiathar, the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, who served as captain of the royal guard of David, supported Solomon, David's choice. So he knows who's supporting David. He also knows that they're possibly going to support Solomon. So he goes, politically, he goes after those people. Because if he gets their support, he's in. Also very clearly, he's a son of David. So I can imagine he must have some brains. He might be thinking like his father. However, they said David had promised the throne to Solomon. David had enough influence for his choice of his successor to be respected. When David died, Solomon became king. If we just evaluate his reign and just take a look at what he achieved, or just his person, then Viertel says David had been honored as the greatest king of Israel's history by controlling his personal ambition to replace Saul. He had a tremendous amount of self-control. And a good leader, that is one of the qualities that he must possess, self-control. By controlling his personal ambition to replace Saul, David's early conduct was beyond reproach. He was loyal to his king even when Saul was contriving to put him dead. Not only that, he was a smart diplomat and a very able warrior. He was a politician. He entered into numerous alliances and sealed them with marriages. He also used the religious sentiment of the people to achieve political ends. However, many of his religious activities reflect genuine piety. And the writer makes that claim if you go and look at the Psalms specifically. If you hear David's heart when he speaks to the Lord. The moving of the ark to Jerusalem helped to bind the tribes to himself and to his capital. And he respected the priests and made them part of his cabinet. He was rebuked by prophets, but also returned to prophets for guidance and inspiration. You see, here was a man who could take criticism, good and bad. Also a very good quality of a leader. He sought the counsel of God before entering into battle. Again, a man who wants to hear the voice of the Lord. He wants to know this is what God is saying to his people right now. David's reputation as a musician and poet was established at an early date. He gave a beautiful lament concerning Saul and Jonathan. Numerous songs are attributed to him. Lastly, David built upon the foundations laid by Saul and constructed a great empire. His reign was not without problems, but there is no comparison between the wealth, power and dignity of his kingdom and the Israelites under the judges less than 50 years before. David made Jerusalem the holy city of Israel, and it later became the holy city of Judaism and Christianity. That's the end of that lesson. So we're literally moving over now to Solomon, but also we're looking at what we call the division of the kingdom. Even though it's by succession, if you go and read the story of Solomon, this would be true, that the kingdom of Israel gained widespread respect under Solomon. His reign provided a golden age of wealth. Although his reputation for wisdom spread throughout much of the world, he actually established policies that eventually led to the disintegration of the kingdom. Isn't that just a paradox? He asks for wisdom, yet his kingdom falls apart. You see, wisdom is the practical application of knowledge. So when knowledge is not applied, then you are not very wise. Important to note that Solomon broke the covenant and worshipped other gods. We'll take a look at that now. And then, very important, under David, there's no taxation system in place yet. But because he's building a palace, because he's building the temple, he needs money. So what does he do? Besides the alliances and the imports of the most beautiful of wood, of gold, and whatever he needs to build this temple and palaces, he's going to need money. And so he starts taxing the people. In fact, he starts overtaxing them. If you look at our current system here in South Africa, if you put together all the taxes that we pay, because on your salary it's 18%, but if we add all the other little taxes that you're nailing over, you're looking at almost 35%. Currently, if you earn $1.5 million, you would pay up to 45% tax of that income. You would only get about half, just over half of it. It says he did not worship David's example. He did not follow David's example, but turned aside to worship other gods. The political issue that undermined the strength and unity of the kingdom was overtaxation. The splendor of Solomon's course, the magnificence of his building project, and the extravagant style of his personal life required such heavy taxation that the foundation of revolt was laid. Your people will revolt when you bring poverty on them. It was true then, it is true now. In any country where there's poverty, you will bring revolt. People will only take so much. A man in the street will only take so much. The sad thing is, when they revolt, they first turn on themselves, they burn down their own houses. And that is also, historically, that can be proven, that the poor will first turn on themselves. When you are depressed, you're more likely to take your own life, so you turn on yourself. What books do we use to gain most of the history concerning the political and spiritual activities of this period are limited primarily to 1 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles. We're not going to go into depth with that. So let's look at Solomon's reign. According to Bathsheba, the second son Solomon had been promised David's throne at his death. Okay, the first son of David and Bathsheba, who had been conceived out of wedlock, died shortly after the birth. So by promise, by succession, rather than God's chosen. He's anointed by Zadok, one of the people that Adonijah tried to gain friendship with, to see if he can ascend to the throne rather than Solomon. But see what Solomon does. Adonijah, who's possibly a risk to his throne, sentenced to death. Adonijah had appealed to Joab, who was the commander of of David's army. What does he do with him? He disposes of him. Abiathar, the priest, he banishes him. So anybody that would cause harm in his empire or in his kingdom that he wants to establish, he takes out immediately. The same is true today. If the cabinet gives you grief, remove them. If they're not going to play along according to what your policies are, you're more than likely to remove them because you want to implement a particular policy or policies that you think either fit for the nation or maybe fit for your pocket, whichever is true. Let's not do name calling here. Solomon's accession differed from the tradition of Saul and David. The elders of Judah and Israel were not included in the installation. You see here, already the people is not asked to be part. The people is not asked to confirm. Like in the case of David and Saul, there's God who chooses, the people affirm this is God's choice. Yet nobody is involved, not God nor the people. Solomon had not proven himself in battle, and there was no manifestation of a divine experience. In other words, a prophet coming to say, this is the word of the Lord, this is the man of choice. He was designated king by his father. Okay, so the first thing he does is, like all good leaders, he takes a census. And I think that's what any good leader does. In fact, they take a census. You see who your people are. You see what they're capable of. That's why the census was taken before they went to war, to see who was fit to go to war. That's what we're supposed to do in churches, to see whether we're up to standard to fulfill the commission. We take a census. We see what's available to us. So when you get into church, and that's the first thing you'll get to do while you're knowing your people, you'll get to know who they are and what their gifts are. So that when you come with a vision and you put the vision into place, you're on your way. You see, David had taken the census of the land towards the end of his reign, and Solomon put into effect the program worked out by David's officials. See how they build on his others' foundations that is laid? They don't discard it. They're wise enough to see history for what it is, its worth, and then to use it to their advantage. The funny thing is, Solomon's son does not do that. I think that's Rehoboam, not Jeroboam, Rehoboam. His son, he knows his father overtaxes the people. His father dies. He is going to rule now. The leaders of the tribes come to him and said to him, listen, the people are being overtaxed. You've got to stop this now. He walks away from him and he turns to his peers, who is as young as he is, who is as unwise as what he is, and he follows their knowledge and he increases taxation. He does just the opposite. What David and Solomon done, they looked at history, learned from it, built on the foundation, the good foundation that was laid. He says, no, I will not learn from history. I will go to the unwise. I always think of Julius. If you listen to him at the beginning when he started off, unwise in the way he does things. But the more you listen to him, you'll see that his language is changing. Because what he did was, he actually went to go and study, he actually went to go and complete a degree. He's got a degree behind his name, and that is why he's making fun of the president. Not that I always agree with that. But he went to go and do something about it. He attained some knowledge. So he obviously went to go and learn the history of the country. He went to go and learn about the systems, and so that he can decipher how, if he came to power, would possibly rule. Not that that is an impossibility, you don't know that. But he's clever enough to go and study history and to see what's happening. See what else he does. He divides the nation into 12 districts, not 12 tribes with their own land. 12 districts. Districts meaning it's his borders that he's creating. It's his form of control. Not what God established. You see how they go up against God all the time. The districts did not follow the old tribal boundaries, but parts of various tribes were combined in order to reduce tribal loyalties and to bind the people more closely to the central government at Jerusalem. But by doing this, he also then it sets up his taxation policy. It allows him to do that more effectively. Because he now obviously needs additional staff to maintain the structure. And here we see why Samuel opposed the establishment of a king. He knew this was coming. Again, Solomon, like his predecessor, his father, Solomon enters into numerous foreign alliances, seals them by marrying foreign daughters of rulers. Alliances replaced military force in maintaining his holdings. In order to fortify his holdings, Solomon introduces the horse and chariot as part of his military arsenal. If my neighbor, the Philistines, are using the chariots to good effect, then let me get the same weaponry and arsenal. Let me not be so stupid. Because once they hit the plains of Esdraelon, where they can use their chariots to good effect, I'm of no worth if I don't have the same weaponry. I can't really challenge them, and that's how they lost most of their battles. Solomon also fortified outposts at key places throughout the land: Jerusalem, Asia, and Galilee, Maya possessions, Megiddo, the Carmel range, Gezer, Viertel, and Bala, and then also Tamar south of the Dead Sea. What else does he do? When it comes to the economy, he constructs a merchant fleet which harbors at Ezion-Geber. Remember, Ezion-Geber was the place where the copper mines was close to where the copper mines were. So besides using the copper for weapons of war, he could also export. No, this guy was good. Since Israelites were not seafarers, what does he do? He turns to the Venetian sailors and he utilizes them to manage his merchant fleet. So he brings in people who knows. So when you do a census, same thing. If you are short on certain people with the necessary skills, then go out and go and fetch them and bring them in for that period of time until men or women in your church has been trained up to fulfill their roles. Solomon also develops overland trade with Sabaeans to the south, whose kingdom centered in modern Yemen. Alright. He strengthens Israel's economy by developing copper refining at Ezion-Geber. Well, Solomon, it says lastly, was able to develop a lucrative trade as the middleman between the two countries. That would be Egypt and Cilicia. But I remember there was quite a few what we call trade routes running through Israel or Canaan, which unlocked the wealth from Egypt, from Asia, and on the Mesopotamian side towards Europe. So a lot of the trade routes was running through Israel. He utilized that now to his advantage. Building projects. Solomon trading and mining industry brought great wealth to Israel, Viertel says. Agricultural production improved with the introduction of the iron tip plough. You see now how he uses the iron and copper that he is mining from Ezion-Geber. And the increase in wealth made it possible for the king to engage in numerous building projects. Now there's two building projects obviously. One was the temple, which took about 7 years to build, overlaid with gold. The most elaborate building was the temple, which started in the 4th year of Solomon's reign and 480 years after the Israelites departed from Egypt. The temple was constructed on the old threshing floor of On in the Jebusite, where David had erected an altar for sacrifice to Yahweh. to stay the place. The location was in the vicinity of the area now known as the Dome of the Rock. The other major building project was the palace, obviously, that he built, which consisted of a judgment hall, the king's residence, and then also the house of Pharaoh's daughter. Remember, he had to house, 1,000 women, eh? 700 concubines, 300 wives. Good grief, eh? 700 concubines.
Yes, 700 what?
Yeah, 700 wives and 300 concubines. I mean, seriously, this guy's crazy. One woman is enough. One woman is enough. I think God knew that. And this is where I don't get him, you see. This is where I don't get his wisdom. You see the wisdom in so many places, and then you see the other end, where he's not so wise, where the passions rule. In the New Testament, you often get the verse which says, don't let your passions rule you. Don't let them control you. In his case, that is what happened. Solomon's building project extended from Jerusalem to a number of towns that were turned into fortresses. The numerous stalls for horses, paved streets, and extended walls at Megiddo are examples of the extensive building that Solomon did. Apparently, he used forced labor from the Israelites, laid heavy tribute on conquered people, and taxed the Israelites excessively in raising funds for this work. These measures prepared the way for revolt upon his death. If we evaluate his reign, when he's done, Solomon's reign reveals him to have been a person of unusual strength and surprising weakness. Amazing, eh? While developing the economic potential of the empire created by David, he also established policies which started the empire towards disintegration. He was not a skilled and seasoned warrior like David, but fortunately did not need to be. David had completed the task of bringing surrounding empires into submission, and the Israelites experienced a relative peace during the generation following the death of David. He never engaged new conquest. There were no real wars when Solomon reigned. It was diplomacy all the way. Whereas war with Saul, with David it's war and diplomacy. With Solomon it's only diplomacy. So the manner in which they rule changes completely. With Saul, he had to bring together the tribes to create some sort of central authority. With David's case, he established the foundations for what we call central government. So he divides up the tribes into regions rather than their actual boundaries. But with Solomon, he comes along and establishes that. There's the issue of now building the temple and obviously a palace. There's no taxation yet. David lives off the spoils of war, so there's no indication that there's any taxation. Yet when Solomon comes into power, immediately now, because he's starting to build the palaces and whatever, fortifying the country, creating wealth. You also need money to create wealth. So to create that wealth, he first has to tax the people, and that taxation gets heavier and heavier. His son Rehoboam doesn't do a good job. When Solomon dies, Rehoboam makes it even worse. He overtaxes the people. Also under his reign comes the split. The seeds for the split is there. It appears that Solomon consolidated and maintained the empire by entering into alliances with foreign powers and by sealing them with marriage to numerous foreign noble women. And this was his downfall. Remember, in the time of the judges, they were always moving towards the idols. Why? Because they didn't drive out the nations who were serving the idols. In this case, he is bringing them to himself. And he brings with them their gods. He even builds, when he builds little palaces, he builds little shrines for them so that they can worship their gods. He's just amazing. And the one end he's so clever, on the other end he's just so stupid. It just doesn't make sense. His success as a political leader played havoc with spiritual affairs in Israel. His turning towards the gods of his wives violated the covenant of Yahweh and undermined the very purpose of Israel's existence as a nation. Solomon was a person of many abilities, and he is remembered especially for his wisdom. And if we think especially of his wisdom, then you will maybe remember the incident of the child with the two women coming to him. The one saying, "This is my child," and the other saying, "This is also my child." So one son was killed. And then he says to him, "Look, here's the sword. Is it your son? Cut him in half." And the mother says, out of compassion, would rather give the boy to her, give the child to her. And then he says, "I know now what the mother is." We also have Queen, I can't get to her name now, Queen of Sheba, and they speak of Solomon's ability to solve riddles and was tested by the Queen of Sheba. It says Solomon had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. His reign began with his loving the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. It ended with his doing evil in the sight of the Lord, and failing to follow after Yahweh as did his father David. His disobedience resulted in the rending of the kingdom of Israel. And then we see the first bit under Jeroboam, who's met by the prophet Elijah, and what he does was to demonstrate the split in the kingdom. He tears 12 pieces of his coat, and he gives 10 to him. That would be the northern kingdom, and 2 at the bottom would be Judah and Benjamin. Then you have Rehoboam's reign. I spoke to you briefly about that, so we're not going to go through it. Not too clever, not a very clever guy. Jeroboam, who selects Shechem as his capital, perhaps because of its central location and ancient Celtic associations. Since Shechem is difficult to defend, Jeroboam moved his capital to Tirzah. Alright? Jeroboam realized that the people's attachment to Jerusalem, the center of worship, would tend to bind them to the southern kingdom. So that's why he moves it. You see again, same as with the pharaohs, they knew politically how to play with the people's affections to their religion. It would be a diplomatic move to move it to a particular place, to either draw his people to himself, in the case of Jerusalem, which was central, and didn't have any allegiance to north or south. He knew if he left it there, he's going to have a problem, so he moves it into his own territory. It says, David had used religion successfully to strengthen people's loyalty and to bring about greater unity. Jeroboam establishes 2 shrines of worship which utilized traditional places of Yahweh worship. You have Dan in the far north, and Bethel, the scene of God's manifestation to Jacob, was chosen as the southern shrine in the northern kingdom. However, what obviously is going to happen now is, because the kingdom is split, and again they focused on themselves more than the nation or God's covenant, you're going to have loss of territory again, you're going to have loss of life, and quite a number of places is lost again. You have the Aramean province to the northeast, you have the Philistine cities except Gath, you have Moab, which is reconquered by Omri of Israel. And then you also have the trade routes along the coast and the Transjordan, which is lost during this period. Sin brings loss. It never changes. It always brings loss. The last section just deals with what we call the dating of kings. And basically what it does is it says that there's a bit of a problem with the length of Rehoboam's reign if you're looking at how we read it, because there was 2 systems of how they calculated the dates. One would, for example, say, I was king from 2000 till 2010. And in 2010 somebody came into power. Then they would calculate that same year. In other words, they would duplicate the year. So they would add. So if he reigned from 1010 to 1020, we would count 21 years instead of 20 years. So increase the length of time or period. So that was basically all that happened to these systems. The second important thing here that they say is most of the history of the Israelite kings is not necessarily always found in our materials. There's outside materials as well, which helps to establish the actual dates of when certain wars and certain kings were reigning. And they use quite a few. The context, they say, of Assyrian and Babylonian kings with Israelite kings. So they're looking at the context of Assyrian and Babylonian kings who actually kept very good record of their history, as opposed to Israel. Scribes were not doing their job in Israel, so we don't have all that history. Even if you look at the book of Chronicles and you look at the book of Kings, it's a number of traditions that they have to bring together to write those particular books, to establish or give history and also a theological explanation of how God ruled during that time. We're not really going to investigate that. That is maybe for another time, another subject, but not tonight.